My name is Andrea Chapman. I am a community organizer at Empower DC, and I will tell you a little bit more about Empower DC in a second. I am joined here today by Farah Fosse, our new community development director, and I am also, and she's going to be handling the tech, and I'm also joined by our guest speaker, East Peterson-Trujillo, who is the campaign director of the Green New Deal for DC Coalition. So we're very excited to be with you this evening and to talk a little bit about social housing and how we can make social housing work in DC. So as folks continue to introduce themselves, I'm just going to briefly run through the agenda for this evening. So I'll talk a little bit about Empower DC. I do see a lot of familiar names and faces, so that's great if you've been rocking with us a long time. But just to review a little bit about what we're working on, and then we'll get into our social housing info session and talk back. We'll have some time for questions, and then we will close out. And this is just another reminder that this meeting is being recorded. We want to share this far and wide so that everybody knows about social housing and can get involved in this work. Again, thank you for joining us. So a little bit about Empower DC. So we are a grassroots organization. We were founded in 2003 by our current executive director, Parisa Norozi, and another wonderful longtime activist, Linda Leaks. Our vision is DC is a state where human rights and needs are met, systemic harms are exposed and repaired, and empowered residents shape the decisions that impact their lives. And our mission is to build the power of DC residents through resident-led community organizing to advance racial, economic, environmental justice, and I'm going to add to that because that's why we're here today, housing justice. So our values include honoring the history, expertise, and vision of low and moderate income Black and Brown residents, building collective power that demands accountability from decision makers, disrupting the inequitable and unjust systems and institutions we're seeing, and persisting in the determined, uncompromising pursuit of justice. And there's several ways that we carry out that mission and those values in our housing justice work. One thing that we do is our outreach. So we are going door to door to folks that are at risk of displacement, at risk of eviction. We are connecting them with available legal support, and we're recruiting anti-displacement network members. We are also organizing in public and affordable housing spaces. We're organizing tenants to improve and preserve public housing, which we will talk a little bit about today. Also to stop displacement and to expand access to quality affordable housing and holding slumlords accountable. And then we also have our anti-displacement network, which is this space right here. And we are basically trying to build a network, a base of tenants and organizers and advocates that can respond to direct and indirect forms of displacement in DC through information sharing and gathering, collective strategizing, and resident-led community organizing. And if you go to our YouTube page, you'll be able to find our campaign workshop that for anti-displacement that talks a lot about the different forms of direct and indirect forms of displacement that we're seeing in the district and how we're responding to them, if you want to know more. So before we get into social housing, I do just want to take a moment to ground us in the current situation we're seeing, namely DC's affordable housing crisis. And I do just want to say, you know, of course, DC residents know better than anyone what that means and what that looks like. So I do want to, before I start spitting any facts at y'all, I would love to hear from you, your thoughts around DC's affordable housing crisis. And I do have a little activity that we're going to try to capture those thoughts. So bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment here. So we have a Mentimeter word cloud, and it's going to capture all of our answers into one cloud so that we can see collectively what our thoughts are around the affordable housing crisis. So right now I'm sending a link to the chat. Second. I'm sending a link to the chat. And if you click that link, you'll be able to get to the word cloud. And on the side, you'll be able to type in your responses and they're going to appear on the cloud. So I'm going to show you an example of what that's going to look like. So you see the question here, what comes to mind when you think of DC's affordable housing crisis? And then on the right side, you can see I have some responses here, high rent, evictions, and slumlords. I'm going to click submit. And then those answers are going to appear here. So everyone's going to be able to add their answers and they'll appear on the cloud. Does that make sense? And if you aren't able to access the cloud for some reason, oh, I'm sorry. Let me stop sharing for a second. If you aren't able to access the cloud for whatever reason, feel free to put your answers here in the chat and we will, of course, uplift those as well. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again so we can see folks' responses as they show up on the cloud. And I'll give us like a minute or so to do that, okay?
And each entry is like 1 or 2 words, like Andrea put, right? So like high rent, slumlord, those kind of things.
Yes.
But you can put in 3 of them.
Oh, I see a lot of answers coming up already. Displacement, property tax, land prices, potential eviction, slumlords. Yes. Oh, I've heard I put that one. But yes, a good one. Insecurity, high rent, evictions. Yes. And I love that we're also noticing the psychological impacts of all of this, the suffering and depression. That's actually something we talk about a lot in our displacement, our anti-displacement campaign workshop. Profit over people, yes. So I'll give us one more minute on that. And then I just want to ground us in a couple of concrete things that we're seeing in the housing world. But I am seeing a lot of eviction and a lot of displacement and gentrification, yes. And yes, failure of programs. Thank you for whoever uplifted that. That is definitely something we're seeing and something we're going to talk about in a second here. Well, thank you so much for sharing your responses. I'm going to keep going, but feel free to continue putting your responses either here on the word cloud or in the chat. We're going to have a lot of opportunities to share our thoughts here in the chat and in the word cloud. So I encourage you to keep this chat live and, you know, to have those discussions with one another before we are going to have a chance to talk as a group in the talk back as well. So thank you so much. All right, I'm going to share my screen once again. Give me 1 second here. Just need to get my presentation back. All right. So a lot of the things that you all mentioned, like eviction and displacement, failure of programs, those are a lot of the concrete things that we're seeing in DC's affordable housing crisis. So I just want to name a couple concrete examples of that. So, first of all, we're seeing a lack of existing and new affordable housing. So, 5 years ago, Mayor Bowser set a goal to create 36,000 new homes by 2025. And this year, the Bowser administration actually went over that goal. They constructed 36,216 new homes. Yet they still have not met the goal of affordable units. They're supposed to set aside 12,000 affordable units. First of all, that's not even a big number to begin with. And then we're also seeing that it's not being prioritized as we're seeing all these new homes being built. And then another phenomenon we're seeing is that developers are using public land to build more market rate housing. And they're doing that with including like a very small number of affordable units. And yes, there are policies in DC law that we'll talk about in a little bit that can help to, set aside a certain number of affordable units. It's still a very small number, usually around 30% or less. And this is not enough to meet DC's needs for affordable housing. And one of the key examples of that is 1617 U Street, which is actually something that's happening right now. If you want to learn more about that issue, I encourage you to go to our YouTube page and look at our info session that we have on it. And that's another link that I'll include at the end of today's meeting. So yes, this is happening right now. Now, besides that, we're also seeing a lack of investment in housing, and we're seeing more displacement, a lot of the things you already mentioned. So, for example, in the DC budget, the emergency rental assistance program was hit really hard. It was only funded at like 25% of the total need. And we're also seeing another dangerous proposed legislation. It hasn't passed yet, but it is being proposed. And that legislation threatens to limit the number of stays that a person can have when they have a pending ERAP application and are facing eviction. It also the legislation seeks to limit the ways that folks can self-certify for certain eligibility requirements for the program. And also it seeks to reclassify what counts as an emergency. And all that's important because it's really a way to make it even harder for folks to access that resource. And it also is facilitating more and more displacement, eviction and displacement. And at the same time, we're seeing that only 599 housing vouchers were funded for fiscal year 2025. It's important to note that Mayor Bowser only proposed 0, so a clear lack of prioritizing housing and housing resources. And again, that's 15% of the total need. And I just want to show some of the growing eviction concerns that we're seeing. So this first quarter, scheduled evictions in DC doubled compared to last year. And it is important to note that most of these evictions were due to non-payment of rent. So clearly there is a correlation between high housing costs, people not being able to pay, and also the lack of resources to support folks. So these are all happening at once to contribute to this affordable housing crisis. So yes, these are some of the things that we're facing. Of course, there are so many other things, but I just would love to hear from you in the chat. What stood out to you or surprised you the most? Either something a neighbor said in the word cloud or something I may have said just now. And what other trends related to unaffordable housing and displacement are you seeing in DC?
I'll just read one that's in the chat is that Jen Jenkins mentioned that DHS saying that the vouchers for folks exiting rapid rehousing are not in the budget.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that's leading to a lot of people being terminated and not having any additional resources to turn to. So again, it's that failure of programs that someone mentioned earlier in the word cloud. And housing, I think, it's going to continue to be a huge issue in the budget this year. So that's another thing amongst the millions of actions that we can get involved in. Getting involved in budget advocacy is going to be very important for us. How are we prioritizing housing and the money we got in the city? Thank you for calling that out, Farah. Is there any other things that I mentioned or I missed in the chat? I'll take a moment to look.
East was saying, the mayor claiming to care, but just building housing, not affordable housing, as you said, Andrea.
Exactly, exactly. Yes.
And then other people have been raising maintenance issues, repair issues, properties not being kept up, and then just Ron said spaghetti approaches to housing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank y'all so much for uplifting those. These are going to be continuous themes that we're going to see. You'll probably hear it repeated over and over again throughout this session. But yes, that's what we're seeing in DC's affordable housing crisis. Thank you so much for sharing.
Good afternoon. Olena. I live in the old Caper area, which is still Capers to me. But it's beautiful over here. I love my area, but they're not like this someone said, they're not keeping it up. I've been in here 17 years. They won't even paint my place. My vents are black. I'm actually breathing the vents are just black. I can't get them to uh, clean my dryer has been here since I've been here. It's just things that is little that is getting bigger because they're not addressing it. My toilet is running. I've been calling them for 2 weeks to make the toilet stop running. It's just things that is to me is easy. You hire these people that you think that they supposed to do what they supposed to do, but I don't know. Is it the residents? Is it the resident manager? Are they being friendly with them where they're not doing what they supposed to do? I don't know. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm just exhaling. Good afternoon.
No, thank you so much for sharing that because that's another huge issue is the maintenance, the conditions in the buildings. And the fact that you just mentioned your vents are black and people are breathing bad air. And that's another issue that we need to address in the housing crisis. And that's why, Empower DC works on those intersections of housing justice and environmental justice, and also racial justice, because these issues are disproportionately impacting folks of color. So thank you so much for bringing that out. That is definitely another factor of displacement as well, conditions. Thank you so much for, yes, war on the poor. I love that. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Those are some other things that we're seeing. We will, okay, I'll take one more, but we will have some time to discuss in the talk back too. Okay, y'all, but I'm Miss Cheryl, I'm gonna give you one more and then we'll be able to hear from everyone else in the talk back. Okay. Go ahead, Miss Cheryl. You're on mute. Miss Cheryl, you on mute.
I'm sorry. Thank you all. How you guys doing? I'm over here in the Brooklyn Manor community in Ward 5. And as you know, we've been fighting for housing, trying to keep our units over here. We started out with 35 low income units. They done knocked us down. They won't give us no more than 325, but they really done knocked us down to like maybe 225, and 200 of those supposed to go to the senior citizens. We don't have that many senior citizens here on the property. However, my thing is safety. Since they've been doing this redevelopment thing, we have no safety. We have no lights. There's a lot of violence going on the property. We have people pulling up, parking, pulling out their lawn chairs. They're actually terrorizing our community. We're jailed in our own community by outsiders, and management allows it.
Thank you for uplifting that, Ms. Cheryl. Yet another form of indirect displacement, the violence and other community issues that are happening, even outside the home. So thank you so much for uplifting that. So we are going to keep going. We will have some more time to go into deeper discussion later in the meeting. And again, thank y'all so much for being open to sharing your thoughts. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. One moment. Okay, so we talked a lot about the housing crisis, and we do know, and we already talked a little bit about them, the current tools that we have to that the city is providing to address these affordable housing concerns. So I just want to briefly summarize some of the key ones that we have. This is not a complete list. We have many others. But these are just, again, some of the key ones that we have. So first, I just want to talk about one of the key forms of tenant-based rental assistance that we have. Excuse me, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or HCVP. That is administered by the DC Housing Authority, and these are vouchers given to that give housing assistance to low-income households. Residents can choose from any private market housing that meets the program's requirements. And residents are, so the idea is that residents aren't supposed to be quote unquote rent burden, which means that they're not paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And one of the key issues that we're seeing with the voucher program is that, of course, it's currently closed for new applicants. And we're seeing that, of course, the need for vouchers and for these forms of assistance is very, very high right now, as we just discussed. Another form of assistance, project-based assistance that we have is public housing, which of course Empower DC has been very, very active. Shout out to Daniel in the public housing space. And that is federally subsidized housing managed by DCHA, the DC Housing Authority. It provides deeply affordable housing to tenants. And we'll talk a little bit about affordability levels a little bit later in this meeting. So just so you're aware. But tenants, again, are not supposed to be rent burdened. So they're never paying more than 30% of their income on rent. These are the numbers that I got from the DC Housing Authority page. So I apologize if they might be a little off. I'm not sure how often they're updating them, but according to DCHA's page, there are currently 52 public housing properties in DC that are totaling over 8,300 units. Some of the key issues that we're seeing in public housing right now is that while and Empower DC and the Fair Budget Coalition and a lot of other advocates were very active in trying to preserve public housing funds for this past budget season, but there still is a backlog of millions of dollars that are needed to do public housing repairs. And we're also seeing increased action by the DC Housing Authority to transform DC's public housing into voucher-based housing, which of course is leading to more privatization. And of course, that's again deteriorating a publicly funded form of housing that is very essential for our lowest income residents. It's under attack right now. And then other ways that DC or the city attempts to address the affordable housing crisis is by funding affordable housing production and preservation. Some of the ways that the city does that is through the Housing Production Trust Fund, or HPTF. This is the largest affordable housing tool, and it's administered by the Department of Housing and Community Development, which is under Councilmember Robert White. It provides low-cost loans and grants to developers to build and preserve affordable housing. And DC law requires that half of HPTF funds are used to produce affordable housing for those that are below 30% of the area median income. So basically like the lowest income residents of the district. But it does have some issues, some concerns. One of them is that these preservation projects, that they can technically apply for housing production trust fund money, but the criteria that the Department of Housing and Community Development is using to select these projects makes it hard for preservation projects to compete with new production projects. So basically, there's this limited amount of funds, and then there's competition between the newer projects and preserving what we already have. So again, that stems back to that the city's failure to prioritize affordable housing and funding affordable housing. Another affordable housing tool that we have is the Housing Preservation Fund. And this is a revolving loan that allows the city to use private dollars to offer acquisition and pre-development financing to developers for projects that preserve existing affordable housing. So those are some of the key ways that the city seeks to finance us keeping and getting more affordable housing stock. Then we also have affordable housing policy. And these are laws that are designed to incentivize or mandate the creation and preservation of affordable housing, and also to stabilize housing for low-income folks in the district. So some of those policies include inclusionary zoning. So this requires private market developments to set aside a share of their buildings to be affordable at 80% of the area median income. We will get into all of those affordability levels later, as I mentioned before, for homeownership, and then 60% area median income for renters. And DC runs this on a lottery system to allocate these IZ units to people that are in need of housing. So a key issue that we see with IZ is that, of course, if we're talking 60 and 80% AMI, those aren't usually reaching our lowest income renters, that 30% and lower AMI levels. And then IZ also requires just a little tiny number of affordable units, 20 to 30%, which isn't very high. So, and then also we have a lottery system, which, you know, we have a high need for affordable housing. So a lottery system is not going to necessarily meet that high need. And then another policy that we have is rent control. So this limits the, and I'm sorry, I should have named what the law is, the Local Rental Housing Act of 1985. And this limits increases in rent charged for units in certain buildings. A key issue with this, though, is that rent control only applies to buildings, mostly multi-unit properties, that were built before 1975. So we don't have any new rent control buildings that have been added in the past 40 years. So a lot of people cannot really take advantage of this, this law. So now I'd love to hear from you. What are some other key issues that you're seeing with DC's current affordable housing tools? And I'll give us a minute to contemplate that, and I'm going to take a look at some of the thoughts in the chat. And I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. So again, like, what are some other issues we're seeing with DC's current affordable housing tools? And here I'm just adding it to the chat as well. Yes, not prioritizing affordable housing, being told that if you want to live in DC, you can, that it's inclusive. Yes, I'm glad that you brought that up, Ms. Naomi, because that speaks to some of the narratives and the counter narrative work we need to be doing. Like, so for example, when I was talking about, I just want to say this really quick. When I was talking about Mayor Bowser meeting her goals, I actually read that in one of her newsletters. And in the newsletter, Mayor Bowser was very clear to mention, you know, we're providing all this housing, we're meeting our needs to provide housing for the city, but we are missing the bigger picture of providing affordable housing and centering our lowest income residents. So I just want to thank you for bringing that up, you know, the importance of really countering these narratives. All right, let me see what else folks are talking about. Yeah, IZ never reaching its goals. Yes. Or record keeping. Absolutely. Fair shot, not exactly. All right. Well, y'all continue to share in the chat. Thank you so much. This chat is live. I'm loving it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. All right. Well, I just want to thank you so much, y'all, for taking the opportunity to share your thoughts in the chat throughout what we've been talking about so far, as far as the DC housing crisis or affordable housing crisis, and some of the problems we're seeing in the ways that the city is choosing to address that affordable housing crisis. I'm now going to pass it over to East from the Green New Deal for DC Coalition so they can talk to us about another possible tool that we can use to address DC's affordable housing crisis, social housing. Thank you, East. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. And thanks, everybody, for giving me your ears for a little bit here. So I want to share about social housing more broadly as far as how it shows up in the world already, and then talk about the proposal that the Green New Deal for DC Coalition has for our city here. So what is social housing? It might be a term that you've heard or one that you haven't, or that's kind of sounds like public housing, but is a little bit different. And the reality is that it can be a lot of different things, but overall, it's a model that provides mixed income, high quality, affordable housing that is typically owned by the government at some stage of its existence, whether it's the production stage or permanently owned by the government. So to kick us off, like I said, I want to share some examples from around the globe. So the first one to share is what is called the Vienna model. Vienna, Austria, not Vienna, Virginia, right across the river. Vienna, Austria in Europe is probably a city best known for social housing. The term that they use there to describe it actually translates directly to communal buildings, and that's a really good way to think about social housing. Renters there on average pay about a third of what their counterparts in London or Paris or Dublin are paying. And the city of Vienna actually owns around 220,000 apartments, which is a lot. And those house 60% of the city's population. Now, granted, they've gotten to that number because the city established and started to work on providing this high quality, affordable housing to people in the 1920s. So they've been at it for a whole century. And that's what's led to a really affordable and livable city today. They were able to establish social housing by, well, it was really at the end of the First World War. So if anybody can stretch that far back in your memory from history lessons, we had a change of power with the Habsburg Empire collapsing, a literal monarchy being dissolved, which gave some land to the projects for social housing, as well as the new government instituted taxes on luxury items, things like champagne or horseback riding, to make sure that there was funding to establish this housing for folks of various but mostly lower income levels. And you can see in this image, it is one of the social housing developments in Vienna. this building is just like architecturally kind of incredible. It's beautiful. There's balconies on the first like 10, 15 floors. If you look at this development from a sky view, you'll actually see that there's multiple swimming pools on the roofs of these buildings. Like, it's not just a building where there's a bunch of people and provide housing to them, but it's not well kept. It's in fact really well kept, and there are incredible amenities that make these desirable places to live. And that's because the government is funding them. So that's our first example here. The next one to share about is in Singapore. So we're going around the globe here, really. But about a decade later than Vienna, in Singapore in the 1930s, there was an effort to house people who were at the time living in unsafe and unsanitary squatter communities. The first apartments built there were pretty simple, utilitarian, kind of how we think of some of the first public housing projects in the US, where it's really, we're just trying to build a building to put people in without really thinking about what it's like to live there. But now the country owns about 1 million apartments across 24 towns and 3 estates. And even more than in Vienna, these are home for over 80% of Singapore's residents. And about 90% of them actually own their home and bought their homes through the social housing program. In Singapore, it's kind of a combination of social and public housing, or like how we might think about those things. In the 1960s, they turned that public housing authority into a social housing authority. And in the 60s as well, authorized a home ownership program. And here they're really mindful to think about social cohesion and a good mix among folks of different ethnic groups, of which there are many across different Asian ethnicities within Singapore. These are also different, I think, from the example we've seen already, because they're really developed at the level of kind of a town or a neighborhood. They're kind of self-contained neighborhoods with things like a restaurant or shops, schools, religious institutions, along with maybe a health clinic, and then definitely access to public transportation or a terminal for the subway. And then more recently, Singapore's been putting large-scale solar on the top of many of their buildings or on areas that are nearby, which cuts down on the emissions and also cuts down on residents' energy bills. The ownership piece I want to get into a little bit more, because when I was doing research for this presentation, I was really fascinated by that facet specifically. And the way that it's set up is kind of similar to how, for those of us who are working like an hourly or a salaried job, not like a contractor, or finding other more independent work, we have basically taxes, including Social Security, taken out of our paycheck regularly. In that same way, in Singapore, there's something that's equivalent to Social Security. There's basically a healthcare tax taken out of folks' paychecks, as well as a housing tax taken out, which helps support the development of new social housing. But that also, in the way that Social Security is kind of like, you've paid into it for this many years, that's what you get. Or in theory, that's the concept. I know there's lots of concerns about that. By the time people have been in the workforce for 10, 15, 20 years in Singapore, the funding that's been taken out of your paycheck for housing is usually enough to cover a down payment. So I just think this is an interesting model. I don't think we necessarily need to pioneer it in DC, but to think about different ways that we could set up housing, or that housing is set up around the world. So those are some tidbits about the Singapore model, and now I want to get very close to home here and talk about one of the biggest pioneers of social housing in the US. It's actually just north of us here in Montgomery County, Maryland. So in MoCo, the Housing Opportunities Commission is an agency from the 1970s that was established to be the center of developing public housing. It's added recently a strategy that it calls the public developer model. So instead of just managing public housing, it's also doing the work of developing housing. This is all quite recent. In 2021, the county established the Housing Production Fund to fund mixed income social housing. And the first project is a building called the Laureate, which is located at the very end of the metro at Shady Grove on the Red Line. And there we've got an affordable home or one that rents at market rate are completely indistinguishable. So they built this building. It really is a luxury building, but about 30%, or maybe it says on here, yeah, 30% of the units are restricted to folks of lower income levels, but I believe it's just at the 50% of area median income level. It's not providing deep affordability to folks who are making lower than like 30% of the area median income. But right now, after the success that they've seen with this first building, there is now an increase in the funding available. There's a $100 million revolving fund that uses bond financing to complete projects. I think they have like 10 more projects in the pipeline that the county is working to complete over the next few years. We can go to the next slide. It shows kind of this timeline. This I lifted right off of the website of just how quickly Montgomery County was able to scale up and create a project that embeds some level of affordability for housing. But it's a little bit similar to our zoning regulations in DC as far as the level and amount of affordability it provides in one building. So hopefully they'll increase that for future projects. But this is really reflective of a growing movement in the United States to push for social housing. There's been bills introduced in New York State, Rhode Island, Seattle, Hawaii, Chicago, and actually a week ago, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Tina Smith introduced a federal bill that would push for not only social housing, but other alternative models to profit-driven housing, things like land trusts and cooperatives. So we're really excited to be pushing for an option like this in DC as well. I think this is my next slide. Just talks about the vision for social housing in DC. So our coalition has worked with Andrea and folks in Empower for the past couple of years, as well as communities across the city and other organizations to help Councilmember Denise Lewis-George develop a social housing model for our city and introduce a bill that would remodel or construct social housing developments to really high standards, create a new agency to manage social housing developments, which gets away from the disappointments and mistrust that we have in some of our current housing agencies. Would support tenants to create leadership associations and help manage and run their buildings. It would place direct services, things like community organizations or other resources like grocery stores and childcare on the first floor so that they're right there and accessible. And then prioritize residents to have the opportunity of employment in the building itself. So this is our model, our proposal. It's gotten a lot of thought and feedback already, but we welcome listening to all kinds of residents' ideas of how we can make this even better. But now we just have the opportunity to share in the chat what stood out to you about the different models, that I shared from around the world or about the DC model that we are proposing.
There's a question in the chat, East. I don't know if you want to take it now, but it's a pretty good question. It says, in 3 sentences or less, how is social housing different from traditional public housing?
All right, let me winnow it down to those 3 sentences.
We're going to be very strict about that, so.
All right, somebody's helping me out in the chat. I love that. Carol, yeah. So our proposal has tenant management in there. I think the biggest difference is that social housing is intended to be mixed income. And that's an important part of the financial modeling as well. Right now, public housing is a critical resource and also is in disrepair across our city and the country because our government refuses to put the adequate funding into repairs and more and refuses to listen to the tenants there. Social housing as a model, and I'll get into this a little bit later for our model, but it says we want folks who are below 30% of the area median income. We want folks in the middle who are still low income, but maybe making 30 to 50, 30 to 80% of area median income, as well as folks who can pay market rate. And we're putting all those folks in the same building together so that people who are paying market rate, they're paying more, obviously, than the rest of folks in the building. And that is kind of providing its own subsidy to the rent of folks across the building. So that's the biggest difference, is that we're mixing incomes across a building. And then the reality that we're hoping to create is also really high quality new buildings, which doesn't mean that public housing can't have those as well and shouldn't. Like, we absolutely believe that public housing should also get investments and revamps and higher quality from the reality that many tenants experience now. But the model is a little bit different. And I think this is actually a good lead in to Andrea's next section of public housing and social housing and how they can coexist. Let me check the chat for any other urgent questions first.
I saw one, has Councilmember Louis George reintroduced the legislation?
Yes, it was reintroduced in 2023 for this session. As some folks who are deep into knowledge of council may know, we are in the final sprint between now and December of the current legislative session. We're not sure if the bill is going to be moving this year. And if it doesn't, then we know that we'll work with Councilmember Louis George to reintroduce it next year again.
Thank you, East. And I see a couple more questions in the chat, some about cost, and we are going to talk a little bit about paying for social housing, financing social housing in a moment here. So hang tight. And if you have any other questions, don't worry, we still will have time for the talk back and Q&A at the end. I'm going to share my screen again. Oh, sorry, sometimes I cannot get to the button to change slides. One moment. Okay. So making social housing work in DC, because as East pointed out, obviously we are not Vienna, we aren't Singapore, we're not even Montgomery County, Maryland. This is a different city that has its own unique needs and its own unique ways of addressing these issues that, is obviously we need to point that out. So we already started talking a little bit about public housing and social housing and the relationship between the two, the differences. I just want to point out that, and East kind of already reiterated this, but I just want to say it again, that, this is definitely a both and approach when it comes to public housing and social housing. So just because we are looking to explore a new tool for affordable housing doesn't mean that we are dropping public housing preservation. And as I put here, public housing is a central tenet of social housing frameworks, given that, that's centered on, public funded housing and publicly operated housing that's designed to meet the needs of DC, of the city's lowest income renters. So as you can see in this quote from the Alliance for Housing Justice, public housing is a critical source of social housing for the lowest income families. Its deep level of affordability has historically been enabled by direct public funding. So it's very important to keep that in mind. We are not dropping public housing by any means. It's important to preserve any form of publicly funded housing that is supporting low-income renters. And I also just want to point out in our approach with that both and, it's believing, of course, that housing is a human right, that public land preservation is important. And, you know, it also means that we're taking into account the structural racism that exists within the public housing framework. And we know that by implementing a new tool like social housing, that doesn't just magically go away. So any type of social housing framework that we're fighting for needs to include that public housing preservation and that addressing of the structural racism that we're seeing in that space. So I just wanted to point that out because Empower DC, of course, has been very much connected to the public housing fights in the city for a long, long time. And we are going to continue to support residents in that fight. I'm going to hand it back over to East.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. And I'm seeing some folks' questions in the chat that touch on this exact next point here around affordability. I do see a hand. I think we're going to get through the rest of the presentation and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and conversation in a little bit here. I think we only have a couple more slides. So we have affordability of social housing. I saw a great question in the chat of like, a lot of times the narrative at least is that rich people don't want to live with poor people. I think that is such a fair thing that we have to take into account as we're building this. And I think one thing that we really strive and that you saw in the Montgomery County model is that all the units are the same. Everybody deserves safe, affordable, beautiful, high quality housing, no matter their income level, and to be able to pay for that at a level that works for them. So that's kind of the principle that we're thinking about. And instead of kind of the reputation of affordable housing, which is a little bit potentially lower quality or having the damage, or like we talked about, the disrepair that has unfortunately befallen public housing in ways that are incredibly unjust. Having high quality buildings, I think, takes away some of that piece of it. It's not a perfect salve, of course, but part of it. So this quality housing for all, but no one is paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. It's basically an equitable distribution of rent. If I'm going to do something with my friends, sometimes we'll say, okay, those of us who make a little bit less money are going to contribute a little bit less to our stay at this house. And some of us who are able to are going to contribute a little bit more. It's expanding that principle of equity to where we actually live. So these are the kind of buckets that the social housing proposal in DC would serve. 30% of the units we plan to be affordable to folks who are extremely low income, making below 30% of area median income. 30% affordable to folks who are either very or low income. And these are all kind of technical terms that we understand. And there's a chart on the next slide that plays those out. And then 40% of them are rented at the market rate, like I said. So I think we can go to the next slide. And this is, I just wanted to give folks a sense of like the scale of what that looks like. So if you're making these amounts or below, then that's what the bucket that folks would fit into. And then again, no more than 30% of that income would go towards rent in a social housing development. And protecting that affordability is really important to us. So I think, I don't know if there's necessarily a next slide, but we can, yeah, that's what it is. Andrea already mentioned this, that our housing production trust fund here in DC is falling short of requirements to aid the lowest income renters. This is a report from last spring in 2023. We found, or the first ever and only report about the Housing Production Trust Fund showed that the legal requirements set by council were not being met as far as prioritizing housing production for the folks who are at the very and extremely low income levels. And so I want to say that it's expensive to build housing. It's expensive to renovate housing. As our partners at Empower know so deeply, the price tag that is tacked on to maintaining public housing is the excuse that our governments and agencies have shared for not caring for public housing residents. So I think the reality is just that building housing has a big price tag, but it's also one of the best and most important investments that our government can make into protecting our health, our prosperity, our wellness, our access to resources, our ability to build and maintain communities just has to be a priority. So to fund our social housing proposal, the bill right now allocates 10% of this housing production trust fund towards social housing development for the first 5 years of social housing. Like we talked about, 50% of the trust fund is supposed to go towards housing projects for extremely low income folks. That's not happening right now. So really we see financing social housing as an opportunity to contribute to that percentage that is supposed to be going towards extremely low income housing, to make sure that we get more deep affordability out of the production trust fund. And then we saw multiple different options for financing social housing across the world. So all of those are also up for exploration as well. And it's something that we want to continue to work with our council on, as far as like, how do we fund this over the long term and make sure that it stays high quality housing that protects our residents, our tenants, and keeps folks housed, which is the most important thing. But after it's up and running, there's no need to meet a profit margin like we have for landlords or for a developer or private equity. So any surplus rent can really just go towards building maintenance and improvements or creating more social housing. And then I just want to talk about what the work has looked like so far, and then we're excited to take your questions and get to this discussion. So Empower, along with a bunch of other organizations, are on our steering committee and really influencing the direction of the work that the Green New Deal for DC Coalition does. Those organizations include Jews United for Justice, DC Jobs with Justice, Metro DC DSA, Voices in Action, Sunrise Movement DC, and Mikasa. And over the past few months, we've been conducting a lot of community and organization outreach. We've been canvassing across mostly wards 1 and 4 to start, and then we're expanding across the city. But we started where volunteers have wanted to canvass their own buildings. We're really, through that experience and through tabling at events across the city, collecting stories of what challenges folks face in their buildings and more. We're also building partnerships with unions and labor organizations, affordable housing developers, and more to come together and make sure our proposal is as strong as possible and figure out how we can actually implement it once council passes the bill. And then on that front, we've been meeting with Councilmember Louis George, the primary sponsor of the social housing bill, as well as Councilmembers Robert White and others who are in leadership positions and would be able to direct this bill through council. I saw somebody ask in the chat earlier if we're doing full court press to push this bill through the end of the year. I think we're in a bit of a wait and see moment right now, because as a part of the broader housing advocacy ecosystem in DC, we know that fighting the proposed legislation that will amend ERAP and make it inaccessible to so many more people is going to be really critical. And we want to make sure that we can lend our voice and our strength and our power to that, and work with housing advocates on addressing the emergency as we also try to implement some systemic change through the social housing bill. So I think that's the big pieces I was going to cover. And I think, Andrea, I'm passing it back to you.
Thank you so much, East, for that awesome review of social housing. I am going to go ahead and move us on into that talk back and Q&A period. So give me 1 second as I get the questions together. Okay. So I know that you all probably have a lot of questions as well. So I do want to leave space for that. But I also just wanted to bring these questions to folks' attention as well. And I originally planned for to have us fill in another Mentimeter to capture all these responses. I might put those links in the chat so you can feel free to fill them out, but we can also just start to come off mute, y'all, and just, start to share our thoughts. So I have 3 questions here. What excites you or concerns you, or both, about social housing? What other important factors should we consider to make social housing work in DC? And what other things do you think we should be doing to get social housing passed in DC? So East already named some of the advocacy and organizing we're doing. So if you got any other ideas, we would love to hear them. But we're going to be calling on you to support those ideas once you share them. So yeah, if folks could just take a moment to share, you feel free to come off mute. And then if you also have any questions, feel free to start thinking of those as well. Ms. Lewis, I see you had your hand raised for a minute. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name.
Uh-oh, you might have broke up for a second. Is that just me or is everybody? Ms. Lewis, you want to, try to mute yourself and come off mute again? We lost you for a second. We can't hear you.
Wondering how inclusive is it? And inclusivity is important because we have a large population of returning citizens, returning back from prisons. And so I just want to hear more about if that has been considered in terms of your research. And the canvassing is the other piece. The canvassing I was hearing was done so far in wards 1 and 4. I would love to volunteer to canvass returning citizens and low to moderate incomes in other wards, specifically around east of the river, which is another population that has been historically left behind. So just want to hear reflections or feedback on how you all have considered that.
Thank you for that question.
And I'm sorry if my sound is distorted. It's because I am on a headset. But if I need to type it in, I can do so in a few minutes because I'm currently driving.
No worries. I think we got the most of your question. Yeah. East, you want to go ahead and answer? Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Lewis.
Yeah. And I might start the second question first, because Andrea and I were just having a conversation about expanding our canvassing efforts last week. So I really appreciate you volunteering, Ms. Lewis, and we would love to work with you on that. Full transparency. Oh, okay. I can repeat also the question for folks who missed it was what is the canvassing effort and outreach going to look like in other wards, especially to folks with low and middle incomes east of the river. And then also, what are the plans for inclusion and inclusivity within social housing developments, especially given that we have a lot of folks returning from being imprisoned and in other, I think that was like the main thing that I heard. And so how are we including folks from all kinds of backgrounds and experiences in social housing developments? I think that's a great prompt to think more about specifically inclusivity with regards to folks returning from being imprisoned. Lewis, I really appreciate that thought. There's a couple of specific things that it prompts me to think about that are already in the bill, and then I think there's room to improve on things. The one thing I'll say is that implementation of the bill, for once it passes, will have lots of opportunities for community input. So I hope we can count on you to be at those forums and more. There's a couple of different populations that have a little bit of priority in living in social housing developments as the bill is written right now. Those include folks like healthcare workers and teachers. But overall, one of the big parts of the bill is setting up a really transparent system to know if you're going to hear back, when you're going to hear back about potentially living in a social housing development. I know that folks have mentioned no communication or inability to find out information being one of the most frustrating parts of our affordable housing access in DC. And that is something that is a big emphasis within the bill itself. And then the other key thing is that there's a priority and a premium on residents actually working to both maintain their buildings and working in the buildings, not just on maintenance, but on leasing, on landscaping, on other pieces like that. So there's employment opportunities that can come with actually living in a social housing development. So for folks who are returning and looking for employment, that could be a great connection to make. The last thing I'll mention is I said the kind of ground floor might have things like resources for communities. It might have a grocery store, it might have a childcare center, it might have all those things depending on how big. One of those options would be like a social worker or somebody else, or access to employment opportunities. So that can be informed by community input at the implementation stage, but I think all those are options that can contribute to a successful experience for all kinds of folks in social housing developments. Andrea, did you want to add anything?
I think you covered it. Ms. Keisha, I see you have your hand raised, and I see another question that I'd like to uplift in the chat after Ms. Keisha goes.
Hey, what I want to understand is, with the social housing, is this going to be something that they build, or is this something that's going to be integrated into already established buildings?
There's options for both. That's a great question. So there's options to build new buildings and have them meet really high standards. And then also the first thing that I'm thinking of that's an option for an existing building, wouldn't be the only one, is for folks who might be going through TOPA or DOPA, Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act. Once the Office of Social Housing Development exists, folks going through TOPA could actually opt into being a part of that. And that would connote like certain levels of retrofits to meet the same standards of social housing developments. That's kind of the green part of the Green New Deal of the bill, where we want to be really low emissions. We want to have high quality and energy efficient homes and appliances and everything like that. So there's an opt-in process through TOPA that's built into the bill right now for existing buildings. I think it's probably worth also considering, you know, are there other ways that folks could move their building into this? But those are the ones that we have right now accounted for. Thank you for that question. And Andrea, you said there was another from the chat you wanted to raise.
Yeah, I see a question about the tenants participating, you know, in the you know, the overseeing of the building and you know, all of that. And there's a question about like whether, you know, how are we supporting tenants to do that kind of work? How are we equipping them, especially tenants who have mental health needs, or we all have mental health needs, but you know, tenants who suffer from mental health issues and may need additional support. So yeah, how are we going to provide the resources and support for tenants to be able to be a part or to be a part of the oversight of these buildings and effectively do that?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple of things in the bill that I can think of around information accessibility, the building's management, which could be contracted to a private manager, but with tenants, boards able to fire them at any time, really, is required to share kind of a report of how things are going in the building to tenants, I believe twice a year, both via email and then have printed copies available. So access to information about the building is one of the first steps, and providing that equitably across tenants. Nobody is required to be a part of tenant leadership within the building, but there will be tenant boards established that then can work with the Office of the Tenant Advocate on any needed advocacy there. And I think this question is really just making me think that it's something that we should think more about, of that balance between making sure the tenants are empowered to have a say over what's happening in their building, but also that it's not too much of a burden on folks who may find it hard to participate at that level, or may not be interested in that. Some people, like somebody said, are just looking to be left alone and live their lives. So I think that's a good question for us to keep plugging away at, and we can bring it back to our steering committee, Andrea.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, this is definitely what we have right now is not the final like end all be all thing. This is an evolving process, and that's why we definitely want to make sure that we're providing the space for the community to come together and have these conversations and talk about the key concerns so that we can start to address these things right away, because we want to advocate for the best version of the bill that again centers the needs of those lowest income, those who are most vulnerable to displacement. So yeah, definitely happy to have these conversations and to incorporate all this feedback. And definitely this don't got to be the last time. I'm just trying to see if there's any other questions. I see something about the labor lens.
I was gonna get to that too. Yeah, thanks Jules for this question about labor, how to run and maintain buildings, and how people actually acquire this experience. So we've worked pretty closely with folks at the Baltimore Washington Building Trades Council, which brings together a bunch of different unions under the building trades, everybody from carpenters to pipe fitters and folks like that, as well as our local painters union, have read through the bill and given us some important insights, and they're really excited, most of all, I would say, about the opportunity for tenants to work on work in their own buildings. I think the other thing that I somehow didn't mention, but the Office of Social Housing itself will have an oversight board, which will include some folks from the tenant unions or tenant boards. It'll include some folks with experience in affordable housing development. And then also our labor partners have requested to be present on that board as well, which isn't in the bill right now, but it's a change that we're working with the council members' office to make. And so these folks are really invested in making this a reality and hopefully getting as many buildings built with, good, strong wages and our union partners as possible. So really love the uplifting of that. It's one of our big values within the Green New Deal sphere, is making sure that we're moving in solidarity with different justice and labor movements and creating a climate safe and climate resilient future that gives everybody good opportunities for high paying jobs and healthy and safe housing. Thanks, Farah, for sharing the website.
I do see another question in here about Green New Deal building candidates. And I do want to just plug 1617 U Street one more time. So, I mean, obviously, it doesn't always have to be an existing building that you build social housing in, but one of the things that we're also exploring right now is the ways that we can, look at existing public land that folks are trying to upzone into market rate, high density market rate housing, and how we can not only preserve the public land, but use that as a pilot site for social housing. And so that's what we're trying to do at 1617 U Street right now. Recently, the zoning commission approved upzoning to basically a 10-story building with a penthouse on the U Street side of the property. And it's mostly market rate housing that's going to be there. And we are advocating for, instead of that privatization and that loss of public land, that we instead preserve it and use it to meet the needs of DC's lowest income renters by piloting social housing on the site. Not to mention that U Street has already had so much displacement and so much loss of its Black residents, especially. So I just wanted to point that out, that we are considering a lot of existing sites as well. And I am gonna, before I stop talking, I am gonna put in the chat just a couple links that I had been mentioning this whole time, so that folks can check them out for themselves. So I'm putting it in the chat now.
Something else I'll mention about the social housing proposal that is a priority for our coalition, as well as Councilmember Lewis George, is that the majority of the units would be multi-bedroom and adequate for families, not just a studio apartment. We can build a ton of studio apartments that are rented at a lower rate, but that doesn't accommodate so many of our families who deserve to have a home altogether. So that multi-person part of it is a priority as well. Ms. Cheryl, did you have a question or a thought? I think you're still on mute there, though. We get to see your face. There we go.
Sorry about that. No, I really didn't have any questions. I just feel like, that the mayor could do better when it come down to housing. I know you guys don't want to go after her, and I'm not going after her. I'm just speaking the truth that and the councilmen, that we put in office, and I think we should let them know that it's because of us that they're there, and if they're not here to help us, they're here to hurt us. So, it's sad to say that, our livelihood depends on them. And I just think, they can do much better. That's my last words.
I agree. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
And I hope that you can help us tell them that.
Oh, I think we should go down to the Wilson building and shake that tree. Hey. So just let me know when.
I love it. Janine, Miss Janine.
All right. Crazy computers. Anyway, I it is so confusing uh, about what is out there. I I actually cannot get it. I mean, it's too much. It's too much. But one thing, and you're talking about Singapore and also Vienna, it seems to me that showing what other countries have done and has been successful, and Montgomery County seems to be kind of, at least they've gotten one and now they've got a second project going. Um, I actually thought social housing was some sort of group homes. I didn't even know what it was. So it just we just got so much more work to do to make clear. And one other example, this is film that really pisses me off, and this was the Wardman Park. Oh, no, Bowser let it go out and be bought. Okay, so the developer, I think it starts with a C, I've forgotten it. And they are, for that place down there, they are maybe doing 7 or 8, just pittance of low income. And it's barely low income at that. Whereas down in Southwest, they're doing, 10, 15% in a building of, lower income. Now this makes absolutely no sense. Absolutely no sense. And I've really been shocked at what I've seen at Southwest. I don't think they've done anything. And this thing with Wardman Park was just, it's just a disaster. It is a disaster. The other thing they're doing is developers are getting these apartments and then they divide them up and make them smaller. And so they can make more income. And that's happening in some pretty upscale apartments around the Northwest. So we've just got a host of issues that are not, I don't think are even being addressed. That's all I know.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought up the whole issue of splitting up the units into smaller, spaces, because that's actually something that I think has me a little hopeful in the bill, is that there is provisions to provide 3 to 4 bedroom 3 to 4 bedroom units so that families can have more space. And because that's a huge issue too, that you can't really afford to have enough space for the number of people in a household. So thank you so much for bringing that up. A lot of wonderful, wonderful conversation here. And I hate to cut it off, but we are coming up at the hour. Doesn't mean that it has to end today. I will share my screen one more time and just share some ways that we can stay in touch and that folks can get involved in the work. One second. Oh, yeah. And I also, if you want to already share an action you want to get involved in, we would love to hear that too. So feel free to share that in the chat as I run through these next steps. And one second, let me share my screen. And again, I just want to thank East for all that you have shared in regards to social housing. So we definitely would love to stay in touch with you. So you can contact Empower DC, or you can also visit gnd4dc.org. That was shared in the chat. If you want to sign up for updates and get involved with the Green New Deal for DC Coalition. Please stay tuned for more details for our October anti-displacement meeting. We are going to try to do a deeper dive into one of the most essential existing resources we have to keep people housed, ERAP. So please stay tuned for that. And I do just want to say, you know, I talked a little bit about the proposed legislation that's threatening to change the way that ERAP works in very key ways that impact tenants. So if you are a tenant that is an ERAP recipient, we would love to hear from you. Please connect with us to share your story and also tell decision makers why limiting ERAP will only further displacement. You know, we just talked a lot about holding these leaders accountable, going up to the Wilson building. So, you know, this is our chance to do that even now. And then I also have Empower DC's website here. And if you want to sign up for specific campaign updates, you can click, so you go to empowerdc.org, and then you can click the tab that says campaigns, and then you want to click the tab that says housing justice, and that will lead you to a page where you can click either Anti-Displacement Network or social housing, and you'll be immediately subscribed to any updates that we have related to those campaigns. And then I also have our socials and my contact information here, and I can share that in the chat as well. And one more thing I did want to mention is that, you know, I heard a lot about like canvassing in other parts of the city. And, you know, if you do live in a building where you think that you and your neighbors would be interested in learning more about social housing, please connect with us. Maybe there's an opportunity there to do some canvassing. We can hold an in-person info session or talk back or whatever. You know, please connect with us. We would love to see how we can work together to continue spreading the word and getting more folks involved. And I do just want to thank you so much for joining us this evening and for having such a lively discussion.